This podcast is all about improving your reptile husbandry. However, I know not everybody has the time or the money to go out and spend thousands of dollars doing custom builds. Thankfully, friend of the podcast, Josh Halter, aka the Bio Dude, is working hard to make better care more accessible. He makes turnkey bioactive kits for leopard geckos, ball pythons, tortoises, invertebrates, dart frogs, and the list continues to grow. He has spent years testing and perfecting these handcrafted substrates and dietary supplements to create the most effective products. If you visit thebiodude.com, you will see he is a proud supporter of both USARK and responsible reptile keeping, and there is an option to donate to either at checkout. Welcome back to the Animals at Home podcast. Thank you so much for tuning into today's episode. My name is Dylan Perrin, and today I have a very special episode with Thomas Marriott of Exotics Magazine. We've had Thomas on the podcast before, I think about a year ago now, just to discuss some of the amazing expeditions he's been on, as well as the Exotics Magazine itself. So if you want to double back to that episode, I'll make sure that's in the show notes for you if you haven't checked that one out yet. But today we discuss his latest expedition to New Caledonia. In the episode, we discussed the environment and everything Thomas and his girlfriend picked up about while they were there, the temperature, the humidity, the UVI, the wind, the rainfall, the actual physical environment, the branches and the vines that you see while you're there. It's one of those species that has a very specific and particular environment, and many of us just kind of keep them because they're so easy to keep. We just kind of keep them more generally. So this is an episode, if you're somebody who wants to keep a crested gecko or who does currently keep crested geckos, there's some amazing tips in here how to evolve your care to be better reflection of the natural environment. If you are listening on Apple or any other podcasting app, I highly recommend going back to the YouTube version or the Spotify version to see the video, as Thomas has sent me a bunch of footage of him actually being there, and I think it'll be very helpful for you, especially if you're somebody who's trying to replicate one of these environments in captivity. All right, let's jump into today's episode. As always, this episode has been produced and recorded by me, Dylan Perrin, and edited by Liam Sinclair of Reptiles and Research. Enjoy the podcast. Okay, well, Thomas, welcome back to the podcast. Thanks for being here again.
Thank you, Dylan. It's great to catch up again.
Now we have you, we caught you in the middle of a crazy trip. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about one of your kind of excursions that you've been going on. But right now you're in Nepal. And maybe you could just quickly tell us a little bit about what you're doing in Nepal and some of the experiences you've had.
Yeah, so this has been part of like a wider trip, actually. So I know we're going to get stuck into the New Caledonia stuff in this podcast, but I took a bit of time off for a holiday in Japan, went to Sri Lanka, and now we're in Nepal. So I think last time we spoke, I'd just come back from quite a big trip. Spending quite a bit of time out of the country at the minute. And managed to get some really cool stories for EK. So it's a bit of a blessing that I can work remotely and also bring some interesting stories, herpetology related. In Nepal at the minute, last week I was basically monitoring some gharial nesting sites with a conservationist out here who's been monitoring them for about 5 years now. They're a critically endangered crocodilian, really cool reptiles. They're so sort of distinct with their sort of long snouts, and they're really well adapted to an aquatic lifestyle. If you see their like legs and stuff, they're completely different to any other crocodilians, and they only live in sort of the lowland areas in Nepal and North India, and there's a population in Bangladesh as well. So they only live in a handful of rivers really, and they've had something like 94% range reduction since the 1940s. So they really are on the brink of extinction, but actually in recent years those populations are coming back. So I had the joy of going out there and seeing what conservationists are doing in the field and writing up a really cool story for EK. So that's what I've been doing in Nepal. I got about a month left. It should be good. We've had a few other little bits as well. So I joined a conservationist in Japan working with their Japanese giant salamanders. That story is going into EK. I think it's the next issue, depending on when this episode goes out. And also some really cool herping experiences in Sri Lanka that we've been doing some reels and putting out on social media. So if anyone's interested in that kind of stuff, we're basically doing a bit more on the video content side of things. So if people are interested in that, then definitely give us a follow. And after July, I'll be back in the UK, hopefully doing some events in the UK and maybe further afield. We've got some conversations to be had, but yeah.
Wow. Well, that sounds pretty incredible. I mean, it's for many people, I'm sure they're listening to you, it sounds like the dream job, because you just get to go spend time in little pockets of the world doing these incredible things. And I mean, even interacting and seeing wild gharials is definitely not something that many people will have an opportunity in their entire life to do. So that's pretty cool. So if anybody's wanting more info on that, I guess of course subscribe to Exotics Keeper magazine, and you will get those stories written up so we can hear all about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is a dream job in many ways. It's a job that, I work remotely. I still work sort of 40-hour weeks alongside doing some of this stuff. So it's, there's a lot goes into it. But, it is fantastic to be able to share those experiences and have them myself. As a kid, I never thought I'd be here, especially following a route in journalism rather than sort of biology and herpetology. So yeah, very grateful for these experiences.
Well, let's jump into the New Caledonia trip, because this is, I think, a fascinating thing for many people. One of the weird things about crested geckos and gargoyle geckos is they are incredibly popular, but really there's just not a ton of like in situ information. Now, it's slowly been more and more, but I mean, I go back into like, I started keeping crested geckos in 2007, and back then, there was almost you couldn't find pictures of New Caledonia. I mean, you're not getting any real good information, and slowly it's been kind of progressing. But trips like you went on really do advance how much we know about the location and the environment there. So let's discuss first. I'd love to talk about just how the trip came about. What made you decide to go, and who did you go with?
Yeah, so the trip was actually funded by Blue River Diets, which is a new crested gecko complete diet brand that's launched in the UK, manufactured in the UK, and all lots of natural ingredients. And I'm sure we'll get stuck into that side of things later on. But it's a brand that is going into a huge market, and there's basically they've sent me there to learn more about crested geckos, learn more about the diets, and sort of create some really interesting content, whilst also producing content for Exotics Keeper magazine. And basically, as you say, those sort of missing pockets of information, those habitat shots, those data readings, those things that aren't widely publicized, trying to essentially improve husbandry through that knowledge, and making it more accessible to a wider audience. We know that crested geckos have become really popular and amongst like a really sort of varied demographic of keepers, but a lot of younger keepers as well. So engaging with that kind of audience, with real in situ research and observations was the main sort of focus of the expedition. We went out in sort of March this year, and that's the end of the rainy season. I mean, I think we got it pretty heavy, like it was pretty intense rain while we were there. But yeah, it was to basically take that snapshot of information. So I had a solar meter, hygrometer, thermometer, a decent camera and things like that. There's only so much you can do in a 3-week period of time, but again, it's opening that door to New Caledonia and the wild context of these really, really popular pets.
Yeah. That's amazing. So I would love to know two things. One, there may be people listening that know New Caledonia, but actually don't really have a good visualization of where it is on the planet. So I'd love to know, just for you to specify that for those who are not familiar with it. And then can you tell us the flight path for how you actually got there? Because I'm sure there's no straight flights right to New Caledonia from London.
Yeah, sure. So, it is actually quite difficult to get to. New Caledonia is situated about 1,500 kilometers off the east coast of Australia. So, yeah, I guess the closest big landmass is Australia, but you've also got Fiji, New Zealand, and Japan are all, not a million miles from one another. It really is cast out into the Pacific Ocean. It's quite remote. It's in terms of actually getting to the country, well, it's not a country, it's actually a French territory. But in terms of getting to it, you can go through Paris. I think there are direct flights from Paris. There are also flights from Brisbane, Tokyo, and Auckland, I think. And Singapore. So we went through Singapore, and yeah, went direct there from Singapore. Actually, I was doing a talk to some of the herpetology department at Singapore Zoo the weekend before. So it actually worked out really nicely. But again, even from Singapore, even when you're over that side of the world, it was still, I think, a 9-hour flight. So yeah,
Wow.
it really is quite a remote location.
Yeah, it's so weird to imagine being on an island that is so much in the middle of the ocean. I mean, the fact that people even have established like life there seems just crazy. But it is a relatively established place. So tell me about getting there. Once you landed, was there anything that what was some of the first impressions or immediate things that jumped out about the island?
Yeah, so we actually arrived at night, so it was dark when we got there, but instantly it was super humid. And I kind of had this idea in my head. I actually lived in Australia for a year, so I thought perhaps the climate would be similar to East Coast of Australia. And we were there in wet season, so it kind of makes sense that it would be humid, but it was really, really humid, like easily 90% plus at night. I don't think once the sun went down that it ever dropped below 90%. And yeah, so that first impression, I was like, okay, it's warmer and more humid than we were thinking. And then also it's kind of like it's not got a massive amount of infrastructure. Grand Terre is the main island of New Caledonia. You've got the Loyalty Islands off the east coast, and then you have the Isle of Pines just off the sort of south coast of Grand Terre. And Noumea is like the capital city, and it's a reasonable size, sort of like some of maybe the larger towns in Australia. But around the island, we actually spent a week in a camper van, sort of traveling around some of the national parks in New Caledonia. And yeah, there's not a huge amount of infrastructure. It's usually small villages along the way that are popular amongst, there's like campsites and things like that. And there's also, we didn't notice this straight away, but actually, after we returned from the Isle of Pines, you realize that actually the center of the country is like quite a large mountain range. So there's actually really mixed altitudes. In fact, even like Blue River Provincial Park is actually quite high up. Like, I don't have the exact figures. I think it's probably must be upwards of 1,000 meters. Like they're considerable. You can see them in the distance. These huge mountains, and it actually catches a lot of the sort of rainfall there as well. So it creates all these different sort of climates and habitats and things like that. That level of diversity in New Caledonia, again, I just wasn't expecting. I really thought that it was a unique island, and that the geckos that live on this island have adapted into these really unique sort of groups of species. But it's a very exciting place for somebody who's interested in to hide, terrain wise, much more varied than I was expecting.
Yeah, it's kind of surprising, right? Because it is such a small island to have a large mountain range, and then obviously it's kind of a long and narrow island, so it's very much a coastal island. I mean, coastal island is sort of a redundant thing to say, but because it is so narrow, you're really dealing with ocean activity on either side. It's kind of fascinating. So can you tell us about your initial, obviously the goal was to go there and to find information about crested geckos. Did you originally look on the main island, or was the first expedition to the Isle of Pines?
Yeah, so most of our efforts were in Isle of Pines. So it was actually only me and my girlfriend that were out there searching. But I have a really good sort of relationship with Philip de Bosterlee, who obviously imported the first, or was one of the first importers of crested geckos and first people to breed them. So excellent contact to have actually in this scenario. So he gave us a lot of sort of information about how those first crested geckos were found, and that import sort of how they were imported and that sort of thing. So that in itself was super valuable, because it meant that the research that we were doing and the observations that we were making were from the exact habitats where those first crested geckos came from, which was really exciting. I mean, even for me to sort of walk through some of these forests and know that all of this super well established species in captivity, an iconic lizard species, was like first came from this population, was amazing. And then obviously seeing some of those, how do you say, I guess, relatives in some kind of way, living wild in on the Isle of Pines was amazing. And yeah, I mean, they also on Grand Touré, the small populations that do exist on sort of just south of Mount Zumac, I think, and in the Blue River Provincial Park, they are. It's extremely rare to actually have an observation of those animals. That I think they're very small populations and in very isolated pockets. Whereas Isle of Pines, certainly not like easy to just come across these geckos. You do have to know what you're looking for and where you're looking. But yeah, definitely the most robust population of wild crested geckos is on, or to our knowledge, is on Isle of Pines.
So can you tell us about how you get to Isle of Pines from Grand Touré, and then just the experience of going out and looking for your first geckos?
Yeah, so actually it's kind of easy to get to Isle of Pines once you reach Grand Touré. There's a ferry that goes, I think, 3 times a week. Most people tend to go to Isle of Pines for either a day trip or maybe like an overnight stay. It's super expensive over there, and New Caledonia in itself is a bit of a paradise, but Isle of Pines really is sort of like luxury, because there's 2, maybe 3 hotels. It's still reasonably small hotels, and the rest is sort of small indigenous villages. So it really is quite a remote location. People go there for snorkeling and stuff like that. So these ferries go maybe 3 times a week. You can also get flights. They're a lot more frequent, because I guess the type of people that holiday on Isle of Pines can afford a reasonably expensive flight from Noumea. And I think it takes about, 45 minutes. The ferry was about 2.5 hours, and we were there in cyclone season, and it was kind of awful. I was actually really quite ill when I first arrived in New Caledonia, which sort of we'd accounted for a few days of preparation in Noumea. So it didn't set the expedition back too much, but I did feel a little bit rough. And then hitting the high seas for like 2 hours first thing in the morning was also rather rough. So I was pretty appreciative of the welcome drink when we got to Isle of Pines. But yeah, it's actually not difficult to get there once you get to New Caledonia.
Yeah. There's it's pretty hard not to get seasick when you're on a big vessel like that, and especially with the rolling seas and whatnot. So, how different is the environment once you get to Isle of Pines? Is it visibly like is the vegetation and the plant life very different, or what are some things that jump out compared to the main island?
Yeah. So when we first arrived, obviously we didn't have anything to compare it to. So New Caledonia, Isle of Pines. There were certain observations around the habitat that I wasn't necessarily expecting. So a lot of the forest where you find crested geckos, especially on the Isle of Pines, is like coastal forest. It's really not this sort of dense, lush rainforest that you perhaps have in your mind when we're talking about sort of tropical Pacific Island geckos. It's actually reasonably sparse. The trees haven't got loads of creepers growing up them and moss all over the branches and all this sort of beautiful scenic stuff that you actually see when you Google New Caledonia. The type of flora that grows on Grand Touré, certainly in the popular national parks like Grand Fougère and Blue River, is that sort of like prehistoric looking huge ferns and mossy branches. And actually on Isle of Pines, where we were finding the crested geckos, it was a lot more sparse. It was sort of yeah, like even though we were there in monsoon season, it really didn't stop raining for days on end. It felt like more like dry forest. Again, I don't know, I can't tell you the exact distinction between rainforest and dry forest, but it was like a sparse forest. It wasn't like heaps of sort of mud and leaf litter and things like that. It was actually more sort of broken down corals and limestone underfoot. As I say, there were fallen trees, and there was a lot of vines as well, but there wasn't huge amounts of, I don't know, flowering plants. And in South America you'd see loads of bromeliads and things like that. There was none of that. In fact, it kind of reminded me a bit like the Yucatan Peninsula, in Mexico, where you've got this kind of like dry limestone sort of base with like a tropical forest that you could describe as tropical, but not necessarily as complex, as some of the rainforests in South America, Central America, Asia, I don't know, West Africa.
And are the trees all basically a similar species or a like species? Because I mean, the fact that it's called Isle of Pine, is it just a bunch of pine trees essentially?
Well, again, this is what you would expect, but actually, circling back around to my earlier point, actually, the tourist board actually has a lot to answer for with New Caledonia, because the Isle of Pines, yes, there are a lot of pines. In fact, the whole center of the island is pine forest basically, and even when you're stood, swimming in the ocean, you can see pines around the edge of some of the more like iconic spots on the Isle of Pines. But in actual fact, where the crested geckos are, that's not that habitat. They live in these sort of pockets of coastal forest, which sort of stretch across the north and down sort of into the east part of the Isle of Pines. So even though Isle of Pines is actually quite small, that actual inhabitable sort of space is even smaller, which again was something that I was kind of shocked to see. I think from a conservation perspective, it's sort of well maintained by sort of French government. I don't think there's loads of imposing threats in terms of infrastructure development, but obviously invasive species are the main threat to crested geckos. So yeah, I'm kind of waffling a little bit.
No, that's good. It's good because it's kind of, that's the point, is that many of us are just have these preconceived notions about what it must be like, and without actually being there, you don't know. And the fact that it is such a small niche on an island, I just can't imagine how many more crested geckos there are in captivity than there are in the wild. It must be like 10-1 or something ridiculous like that, or maybe it's even more. Who knows? So in these. So the actual sparse kind of tropical forest is where you actually find the crested geckos. Where are you finding them within that? Like, what sort of an ecological niche are they fulfilling in there, in that range?
Yeah, well, crested geckos is, interestingly, there's when you look at the big sort of iconic species that are popular in captivity and you're looking for them in the wild, there's sort of a different search criteria for each one. So the crested geckos are actually sort of between 6 and maybe 10 feet up in the understory of the forest. They don't necessarily go right up into the canopy, and they're usually sort of higher up. They're not occupying shrubs or anything like that. They are still on these reasonably tall trees, but yeah, every specimen we found was between sort of 6 and 10 feet up. They also seem to have a preference for a species of tree that I'm just trying to remind myself. It's basically called like grey boxwood. It's an Australian species, I think, and it produces berries. Certainly while we were there, potentially year round. Some of the research we've been doing has said maybe that's, they produce berries year round. But also we were finding crested geckos on Australian red cedar, Australian tallowood. A lot of the species in New Caledonia are also found in Australia. There are also a lot of invasive species. So while we were there, we were basically using an identification app to identify as many sort of species of trees and different flora as possible. And yeah, they typically would be sitting sort of on horizontal branches. At night, you'd find them sort of perched, sitting like perpendicular to the branch, where they were potentially sitting in ambush or potentially just navigating that sort of understory layer. We also found them in the day, so they are. You could say active. They're certainly like exposed in the day. So we found specimens on sort of pressed against the tree trunk, really coloured down. They turn like a really dark brown, potentially just for camouflage. And yeah, yeah.
How difficult were they to find? Is it something that you would go out for herping and see two, or were you finding like 10, 20 of them in a night?
Yeah, I mean, we found I think 4 over like a week. So
oh wow,
they're not
so
easy
not that
to
many.
find.
Okay, wow.
No. And interestingly, because I know that we'll get this question, and we didn't find any gargoyle geckos either. So yeah, difficult to find. And yeah, basically the leeches are found much higher up in the trees. So they're on these really thick sort of trees, up sort of in the canopy region, perhaps 15, 20 foot in the like up. Chahua are also that sort of area as well. So they're found much higher than the crested geckos. And then Urodactylodes are sort of on shrubs and stuff like that down in the lower layers. We did find other species. We found some really, really cool stuff. So we were finding these green-bellied tree skinks. I think they're called Epibeta nigrofasciolatus. And we were finding a lot of the litter skinks as well, which are the genus Calodonus skincus, which is pretty cool, sort of named after the island. And we also found a lot of pelagic geckos, which is perhaps some of the only non sort of endemic species, the Nactus pelagicus. So there was a lot of herpetofauna around, and also a few species of bovia, and we were finding sea snakes in the sea quite frequently. Found a few different species. So from a like herpetofauna sort of diversity perspective, there was a lot of different species, and you were seeing them quite frequently. But the iconic species that people in herpetoculture are really interested in were difficult to find. Yeah, we didn't find any. So
yeah,
other than
that's
the
fascinating.
cresties, obviously.
Well, at least you found the crested geckos. I mean, that to only find 4. I mean, at least you found 4. It would have been a shame to go all the way there and not see them, because it's one thing to see the environment, that's important, but to not see the animals utilizing the environment can be really misleading in many ways, because you don't know what they're doing in that environment, and you know maybe you're making these sparse tree environment, but that's not how they utilize it. So that is pretty interesting. What about the tails on the crested geckos? I'm sure many people are thinking, like, did they have tails, or were they dropped?
Yeah, every specimen we found didn't have a tail. I think mostly they are dropped, and that sort of spanned as well. There was some were like really quite beaten up. It looked like they'd suffered a bit of trauma. And then some were like perfect, pristine conditions. We found this beautiful male, like a really interesting color with those sort of hues of like green and a little bit sort of pale. And he was just like spectacular, but again, missing his tail. I think it is just a very common thing. I know like Dav Kaufman's been out there and he's seen some with tails, so it's not unheard of, obviously, but the ones that we were finding had lost their tails, and the ones that we found were also all adults. So as I say, it was only really me and my girlfriend that were looking for these geckos. So you had a team of herpers out there for a few weeks solid. I'm sure you'd have turned up more stuff, but the idea for us was obviously find the geckos, find out where they are, find out more about the habitat that they're inhabiting, and we were blessed to at least find 4 of them.
How exciting was it to find the first one? And can you tell us about that?
I think I teared up a little bit, to be honest. Partly out of sheer joy of seeing a crested gecko, and partly out of relief that I wasn't going to go back empty-handed. So, yeah, and it was kind of unexpected as well. So, I was given some localities or some locales, some areas to search by Philip, but actually it proved really difficult to get up there. So there was not, I don't speak French, and even some of the indigenous people there probably don't speak much French either. But yeah, there's no way I could have necessarily communicated that I was there looking for these long lost geckos to sort of people that own the land in some of these areas, and we were warned against going to some of the spots. So basically, as a sort of process of elimination, I had to sort of think, well, where, if I was a crested gecko, where would I be? The kind of habitats that the research and literature points towards. And there was one area that actually really wasn't far from where we were staying. And I was like, this feels right. A lot of the time you're sort of walking through sort of, because it's all coastal forest, really. It's interesting. There's actually like almost like a plateau where it's like mostly sand. You'll have these sort of palm trees that are producing fruit, but it just didn't seem like the right habitat for crested geckos. And then as you move up, where the sort of you've got thicker layers of sort of stone that sort of capture more water, there's thicker leaf litter, probably more sort of fertile soil. The environment changes a little bit, and I sort of found a trail that was leading through there and thought, yeah, this seems right. But it was the middle of the day and I wasn't really expecting to find much. And then I think I'd actually stopped to photograph one of the green-bellied skinks, and then turned around just against the tree. There was this gecko-shaped sort of object, really dark, darker than I'd ever seen a crested gecko. So I was a little bit thinking, is that right? And sort of went over to investigate, and yeah, just this beautiful female, incredible moment. And again, there's certain times when you just look at a situation and think, wow, what a privilege to be able to do that. Like, how many people get the opportunity to even see a crested gecko, let alone be here with the support of Blue River Diets and actually, solar meter, thermometer, hygrometer, everything else. I was like, right, I'm going to sit here for 3 hours and get as much sort of environmental readings and photographs and stuff as possible. So yeah, it was really, really special.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, you're definitely on a short list of people. I mean, people who live in New Caledonia probably see them on occasion and are not that interested in them. But as far as people who are part of herpetoculture and who are interested in seeing these animals in the wild, I'm sure that's not a massive list. Can you, I want to get into environmental parameters and whatnot as far as in replicating it in captivity, but I'd also love to just the color of the geckos themselves. What did it look like, and how different is it from what we're seeing in captivity now? I mean, as we develop these morphs and whatnot, things change. So I imagine seeing the wild type must be a pretty far removed of what we see on a regular basis in captivity.
Yeah, I mean, the wild type, or the ones that we saw, were really quite drab, but there was something quite nice about it. The actual coloration, we didn't really see many patterns on any of them, to be honest. There was they varied in coloration, so some were like a darker brown, and then obviously that would change a little bit, and then they sort of somewhere between brown, and then there was some with like sort of, as I say, like greenish kind of hues and that really like pale sort of color, but we weren't seeing any indicators of sort of a morph, a potential new morph or anything like that. They were sort of beautiful, but and also their kind of head shape was slightly different. So they had these like longer sort of snouts. I know females tend to have less sort of bulky heads, but they certainly seemed more slender than the crested geckos that we tend to have in captivity. I don't know whether that's because they obviously don't have a beautifully prepared sort of formula waiting for them every night, or whether it's like a genetic thing. But there was some slight differences. But yeah, we weren't turning up some kind of something that hasn't been seen in herpetoculture. Also, we weren't necessarily being surprised by anything that we saw.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the parameters. You mentioned some of the humidity and rainfall and whatnot, but I would love to kind of break this down for people who are trying to replicate a crested gecko habitat in the wild. Some of the major issues with crested geckos, they're so robust that you can kind of keep them however you want. And it's funny how things have changing now, but when I started keeping them, they were basically like, just put them in a box and they're totally fine. Like room temperature, like your humidity of your home is fine, and then feed them the powder and you're good to go. No need for extra lighting or heat or anything. And they obviously are a sensitive species to being overheated, but I think your experience on the island probably tells you that some of those things are maybe myths. So let's just start with the actual climate, temperature, humidity. What were you experiencing?
Yeah, so over the course of the 3 weeks that we were there was definitely a difference on Isle of Pines compared to Grand Terre. And when you went to more coastal regions that didn't have these sort of forests and things like that, it was perhaps more in line with what is recommended in captivity. But the actual data that we were getting on Isle of Pines, and again, we have to sort of we were there in wet season, so that will obviously vary throughout the year slightly. But it was basically temperature was kind of static. Like there's some parts of crested gecko husbandry and that I really think actually people are doing really quite well, and it surprised me just how static over the course of 24 hours the temperature was. I mean, it's we were looking at on average, getting up around 7 o'clock, it was about 23 degrees. I don't know what that is in Fahrenheit, so you might have to.
It's 73. That's the one. Actually, I have my chart over here, but I always remember 23 is 73 Fahrenheit.
Yeah. Okay. So it starts off around 73, and then as the sort of morning progresses, it does increase with the temperature does increase ever so slightly, reaching around 26 by about mid-afternoon.
So it's about 79.
79. Okay. And then we were at the highest temperature, or the highest average temperature over the course of over the course of our expedition was around actually 3 o'clock, and then it reached 28 degrees.
So 82.
Yeah. Okay. and then it sort of like petered off towards the night. But interestingly, it actually stayed at around between sort of 25, 26, well into the night. Like, midnight, it was still 25 degrees. So it is, from a husbandry perspective, perhaps we should be keeping them a little bit warmer, certainly in the wet season. But it doesn't have these major spikes like you would expect from other tropical species. In some cases you're turning all heating off, but actually what we found while we were there was a very slight fluctuation in temperatures. And a similar pattern with humidity, actually. It was basically very humid the whole time we were there. So in some cases, we actually recorded like around 92.9% humidity at like 7 o'clock in the morning. So sunrise was, I think, just before 6. So that humidity sort of stayed throughout the night, 90+% pretty much every time. And then that started to decrease slightly. By about 11 o'clock, it reached 87.4. By midday, 86.9. By 3 o'clock, it was sort of 86.5, 82.9. And then by 7 o'clock, it started going back up again. So just after sunrise, the humidity starts increasing again. So again, more humid than we ever recommend people to keep crested geckos. Usually, is sort of say somewhere around the 70% mark. And in actual fact, over the course, there might be some seasonal variations where actually that is very much justified. But definitely in the wet season, you're looking at, 85% plus, really. And also a lot of the rain the rain was heavy and actually kind of like unyielding, like it wouldn't stop. So there was these intense downpours of rain that I don't think is commonly sort of like replicated in captivity. Some keepers might choose to use a misting system, but usually that's just to keep the humidity within the right parameters rather than sort of simulating those huge tropical storms that crested geckos in the wild do experience. And with cyclones and things like that, like quite heavy winds as well, some of these populations, certainly the ones that, or the ancestors, the ones that are in captivity now, are on the forefront of the Pacific Ocean. There's huge sort of wind, Pacific winds and stuff coming through their environment, and that in itself is something that we encourage, obviously, ventilation and stuff like that, but trying to marry up that really high humidity with a good amount of airflow is a challenge that I think people should be trying to address when they're keeping crested geckos, to sort of take that keeping to the next level. I really, coming away from this expedition and reflecting on it, I'm actually quite happy with how people keep crested geckos generally. So, or certainly the recommendations and the care advice. But there's also these tiny little intricate areas that could be improved and perhaps normalized with our keeping, and the same goes for heat and things like that. There was times that it was reaching 31 degrees on Grand Terray. It also got hotter than that, and that was the very sort of end of the wet season. So I'm sure there would have been days throughout the previous few months where that actually got a lot hotter. And now you're not going to recommend that the first crested gecko keeper goes home and creates a hot spot of 35 plus, but there could be definitely some more research into how we create that kind of artificial sunlight alongside some UV emitting sort of bulbs and things like that, because these crested geckos really are not finding some little hideaway through the day and avoiding all sunlight. Like they're just not. We've seen them out during the day, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Granted, the canopy does stop that UV, and the readings that we're taking from these areas, when there was a crested gecko there, we recorded 0.5 UVI, so not loads, but also we were recording sort of hiding spots from crested geckos and areas within their habitat where they might be occupying as well. And there's probably sunny patches there that actually get really high. Are they spending loads of time under it? Probably not. But are they exposed to UV? Absolutely. At some point, those crested geckos will be exposed to sunlight. And, this isn't new. Like, we're speaking to Philip. I know he told me a little bit about Emmanuel's from Exoterra, his expedition to New Caledonia a little while ago, and said they were finding crested geckos curled up in tree ferns and things like that. And that was where they were sheltering. And even that, you if there's a gap in the canopy, which there is a lot because it's a reasonably sparse forest, that UV comes through. And I would say, UV is essential for the well-being of crested geckos.
Yeah. Well, it's fascinating. And I mean, of course, taking the temperature, we have to be careful with the temperature, as you said, because replicating it in a smaller box has its challenges. We have to make sure that we're not overheating things or creating stagnant air. But I think to say that the 70 degree or the 20 degree room temperature, that's all you have to do, is probably a bit wrong. So I think adding some more warmth to the enclosures, provided that you have airflow, I think is probably a good thing. So as far as the temperatures within the canopy where you were finding the crested geckos, was it around the same, around that 25, 26 degrees, or was it a bit cooler there? The best part about providing high-quality reptile husbandry is you get to develop a long-term relationship with your animal. Meet Jackson, my 18-year-old crested gecko. Jackson lives on the BioDudes Terrafauna substrate, which is one of their substrates that's specifically designed for warm biomes and humidity spikes. Like all other BioDudes substrates, it contains organic content to help support the plant life in Jackson's vivarium. It also holds moisture very well, which means humidity is never an issue, even in my dry climate. Another favorite of mine is the BioDudes Bug Grub. This is a supplement powder made from natural ingredients like carrots, beets, spirulina, oats, and potatoes. Everybody knows how important gut-loading feeder insects is, and this simplifies it for me and allows me to be confident when I feed both Jackson and my tarantulas that they're getting the nutrients they need to thrive. Also, if you have a lot of babies right now, this is a great way to help fortify the diets of neonatal reptiles. The BioDude has a ton of great educational content on both his YouTube channel and the website, all about bioactive care, and it's just one of those brands that's doing their part to push herpetoculture into a positive direction and give reptile keeping a better name.
Yeah, no. So most of the readings that we were taking were actually just in the habitat.
Okay.
So the we've actually published alongside the story in EK magazine. There's all the readings or average figures, and a nice little graph there to show that arc over a 24-hour period. But yeah, we were going out and making sure that we had these readings from within the environment, and taking like a sort of average through the thermometer. So all that data is there, and that is specific habitat data. That's not just as and where we were. In fact, we also did a little video on Blue River Diets to actually address the fact that by the last sort of week of the trip, we sort of traveled a bit around New Caledonia just to get some nice photos and explore Blue River Provincial Park as well, and we ended up by the coast, and the actual sort of temperature and UVI and everything was completely different to the habitats that we were exploring to find the crested gecko. So if the meteorological data that's coming through from, say, Noumea or these sort of areas where there are more sort of human habitation, if that's what people are using to necessarily guide their understanding of the climate or the environmental factors of keeping crested geckos, that's perhaps a flawed method, because these coastal sort of beaches and stuff were very different to the actual sort of high humidity, low UVI sort of regions where the crested geckos are found. And they also don't seem to traverse habitats particularly well. We spoke to just about every local person I could. I spoke to them and told them we were looking for these geckos. No one had seen a crested gecko on the Isle of Pines. And it's, they'd seen or they'd heard of the Leachianus geckos, and they'd heard of it because they're quite common on a tiny little islet just off Isle of Pines called Isla Bros. So they do have people there. They do day trips there, and you can go and see these enormous geckos. But actual crested geckos, nobody had seen them. So I don't think, or I would assume that they don't necessarily move into human altered habitats. They're not sort of congregating around somebody's mango tree in their back garden or anything like that. They actually are really quite selective, in particular with their movement through the understory layers, but also they're I would imagine there's a sense that's sort of pushing them, and again, I haven't done complete research into it, but if it's scent driven, they probably move and through that forest, picking up sort of berries and hunting insects and stuff like that. They're not like things, I don't know, like Phelsuma or like a Dactylus or anything like that, where you leave an old piece of fruit on your front porch or whatever, and they're all over it. They're actually completely different. They have I think they have a more specific kind of habitat requirement than people really understand.
Yeah, they're not adapting to urban environments. They're staying where they basically the niche that they evolved in. And you'd mentioned wind, which is something that I had always thought about just because it is such a small coastal island. Are you feeling that wind within the canopy? Like, is there a breeze coming through, or is it kind of more still air and then you don't feel that breeze until you're on the shore or the beach?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely more sheltered in the forest, as you'd expect. But yeah, you do feel it for sure. Yeah, there's, you know, as I say, these forests are really not that dense. And yeah, you know that you're by the coast. And also, there was areas where, you know, we were finding crested geckos that we just couldn't access at night because once the tide comes in, it would sort of flood the entire area around this sort of pocket of forest. So we were finding them very, very close to the coast, but also there's that sort of distinction because where you've got pine trees and palm trees, we didn't spend a lot of time looking there, to be fair, but I can't imagine it would be the right sort of habitat for crested geckos. Where the habitat we were finding them in was just off, perhaps, I don't know, 15, 20 meters away from the shore. So you can feel it. Yeah. And I guess further up into the canopy and things like that, you'd probably even feel it more.
So I think warm, humid air with good airflow are some three like key takeaways. Obviously, again, we're not talking about heating them to a crazy extent to 90 degrees or anything or into the 30s, but something that's around 25, 75 degrees, steady temperatures, good airflow, good. I mean, that's the key. If you are creating an environment that has a lot of humidity, airflow is real key to make sure that things aren't getting stagnant. Now, what about the actual physical environment? You mentioned some of the trees and whatnot. If you were to replicate a crested gecko environment based off of what you saw in the wild, what are some things that you would do to set that up as far as branching and trees?
Yeah. So the environment is very like three-dimensional, and I'll send some videos and some photos and stuff if you want to put this into the YouTube sort of format. But it's lots and lots of vines and things like that. They're not like vines with loads of sort of moss growing on them or these sort of swinging vines. But they do sort of connect all the trees in a way. It's very hard to describe, but it's a three-dimensional environment. And the crested geckos, when you see them at night, they are active and they are traversing the environment and perhaps moving reasonably far distances for small lizards. They don't seem to have this sort of territory that they don't move from. We went back to the same locations several times to find crested geckos that were completely sort of like undisturbed and stuff, and we still didn't find them. So there's perhaps something in that, and creating an actual sort of terrarium. I would be thinking of having horizontal sort of branches of different diameters sitting towards the top, depending on what your UV setup is. But it's basically a perch for them so that they can sit sort of in ambush at night and also be reasonably exposed. Some vines to sort of, allow them to traverse their environment sort of easily and naturally. We also found that a lot of the trees had like bark that was coming off of the trunk. So whether those crested geckos are using the sort of underside of that bark to hide or not, I'm not sure, but it would be quite an interesting thing that I'd certainly add to my setup if I was to build one. So instead of maybe having these visually appealing sort of hides and hanging hides and things like that, maybe just creating some a cork bark sort of slab that comes out and just see whether they use that as a resting point. If the enclosure's large enough, which I do basically get as big as you can get, like that would be my advice. But then get instead of having these sort of ground ferns that take up a lot of that sort of room at the at the bottom of the enclosure, maybe try to install a fern within a sort of artificial background. So it creates actually a bit of refuge for the crested gecko without the gecko actually having to go all the way down to the ground. Like that's one thing that we didn't find. And speaking to Philip and his conversations with other herpers that have been out there, crested geckos are never found really on the ground. I think there is some research to say that sometimes they might nest in the ground on very rare occasions. But whereas something like a lychee might move all the way from the canopy right down to the sort of bottom of a trunk, crested geckos are always sort of up in that understory layer. So actually providing options, sort of simulating your artificial background as the tree trunk, and then placing your sort of decor, like sort of vertically, I think is a more appropriate way of building that setup. And also substrate wise, we obviously need to hold as much humidity in there as possible, and obviously there's a lot of different ways to do that, but also maybe incorporating some sort of artificial rocks and stuff like that, and actually maybe even flooding the substrate from time to time. And there's some incredible sort of enclosures out there geared towards frogs, really, now the Frogs & Co stuff from Exoterra and things like that, like that allow you to actually flush the terrarium to create rain chambers. I'm not saying that every crested gecko keeper should go out and do all these sort of high-tech stuff, but consider actually every now and again creating like an artificial rainstorm in there. I think that moving water typically is great enrichment for reptiles, and again, it's something that crested geckos will be exposed to very frequently and for large portions of the year in the wild.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And I last summer I had redone my crested geckos enclosure for the first time in like a decade, and that was one of the things I did, was incorporate lots of relatively smaller diameter branches moving across the enclosure. So it's kind of like this network of things similar to what you're describing with the vines. And he uses it a lot, and it's something that in my mind I wouldn't have done when I initially set his enclosure up. I was a lot, I had way less knowledge, because I was thinking, he's not going to use these kind of smaller, more spindly branches, but he does use them a lot. And I imagine in the wild, that's what they use to traverse from tree to tree. So, and that sort of stuff is very enriching, and it's good for their just physical health, right? Challenging them with some smaller things because they're having to climb, different types of branches and whatnot. So sometimes it's good to just really step back and do more random stuff in a way, because that's really what the wild is like.
Yeah, absolutely. And I remember actually the first night actually going out and looking for crested geckos and shining my torch into all of these vines, and thought, this is going to be a hell of a job. It was a little bit daunting actually, because I thought they actually finding a crested gecko in some of these like complex vine systems would be an absolute mission. But yeah, that is what it's like. Like, it's, again, reasonably sparse, but all well connected. The crested geckos never need to come down to the ground. They're so good at climbing, and they even if you disturb one, it will immediately move towards to climb up the tree and start traversing different ways. Like, I think they are far more calculated with understanding their environment and the way that they traverse it than people give them credit for.
Yeah, that's fascinating. You, in the article that you wrote for EK Magazine, you had broke down some myths that we have in the hobby, that you were able to kind of bust in some ways, just being in that environment. I think we've kind of covered some of them. Is there any other ones that you wanted to mention for sure before I want to talk about the diets as well?
Yeah.
You had some good ones.
Remind myself of a few. Yeah. Cheers. Yeah, so we have covered a lot of them. I guess, yeah, I mean, around the sort of topic of diets, it's when you are stood sort of immersed in an ecosystem, you can certainly gain a new sort of perspective on what wild animals eat, especially like omnivores. Even insectivores, you see the huge array of different sort of insects that are out there, but omnivores even perhaps more so. And yeah, I guess the idea that the crested geckos just feed on fruit and crickets is, yeah, just plain wrong. You know, some of these, you know, the crickets themselves. Also, we actually found quite a lot of moths and things like that. We were going out at night with torches on. It's kind of to be expected. But you know, lots of different flying insects, cicadas, beetles, and things like that were the most common insects we were coming across. We were finding crickets. We weren't finding many spiders, and we, you know, we found a few sort of like caterpillars and worms, but not really very much. But yeah, loads of flying insects, and those flying insects obviously eventually gather pollen and things like that. And actually, some of the stomach content analyses from a report that I read back in 2007 said that actually over 10% of a crested gecko's diet is pollen aggregates, which is like huge, you know, considering that like over 40% is then insects and the rest is fruit, mostly berries. And all of it sort of added up when we were walking around the forest. And I guess it's very important that these the diets that we provide are, you know, contain things like bee pollen, like, you know, other superfood things like honey and, you know, other sort of vitamins and minerals beyond just kind of fruit. And yeah, that's an interesting aspect of it, but also providing like a varied insect diet as well. You know, there's so many different ways to offer different kind of prey, and even like allowing certain insects to metamorph into flying insects and things like that, that perhaps actually people are really quite sort of hesitant to feed their you know, beloved pet something that looks as, you know, fierce as a large locust, or, you know, buzzes around like a black soldier fly, or, you know, things like that. And in actual fact, you know, these geckos are living in pretty harsh environments out there, and will take on mostly flying insects actually. So it would be nice to see perhaps more ways of replicating that with you know, other sort of commonly bred insects. I know over here we have things like silk moths and black soldier flies. They're not particularly nutritious, but they might offer that that extra sort of exercise for these crested geckos that are, you know, moving around the understory layers in search of these insects. So yeah, it's not just a matter of they find a piece of rotten fruit and they sit there and lap it up for 20 minutes. Like there's, and even in actually talking about different suggestions, you know, moving that sort of dish of food around the environment and letting them sort of hunt for it and sniff it out. And there's definitely merit in that. You know, they're moving around looking for, you know, tiny little sort of berries, things like, you know, we were finding cheese fruit. Obviously, we weren't doing this sort of invasive stomach content analysis or anything like that. So these are just observations, you know. But the types of fruit we were finding were very small, kind of sweet or fragrant fruits. And so trying to simulate that within the terrarium and maybe having smaller amounts of different flavors and putting them around is quite an interesting thing. I also, while we were out there, there was also loads of snails. So snails are everywhere on Isle of Pines. Escargot is really popular, and they're all over the place. And I know I did some editing for a piece. Oh, actually, I spoke to some friends that were breeding satanic leaf-tailed geckos, the Europlatus fantasticus, and they said that the trick basically for breeding females is feed them snails. They get all the calcium they need. It's a natural way of sort of giving them it, and like it works wonders. And it makes me think, you know, this is again something that I haven't tried myself, but could snails be a really important part of crested geckos' diets that we're just not considering, you know? So yeah, this, I think I'm looking at the list of sort of myths that we were busting. And I know one's that they only eat fresh fruit, and that's simply not true. And also that because they eat lizards, that we can feed them pinkies and things like that. And honestly, I would avoid that. I know that the leeches will feed on cresties, and for them, perhaps there's something in it. But I know there's been a lot of emerging research on some of the Odatria sort of subgenus of monitor lizards that basically pinkies and stuff can lead to gout almost instantaneously. And I'm not saying that we should be scared, because again, we should be pushing the limits and exploring new options of sort of feeding. But I don't know whether a captive cresty necessarily needs the sort of fat and protein that's provided in a pinky, albeit I'm all for sort of experimenting. It doesn't seem like the wisest option.
Yeah, you can definitely get the nutrition elsewhere. And I think the advice of moving the food, especially if you're someone who's commonly using a ready-made food, I think moving it around is such a clever idea. I mean, you're sort of replicating fruit hitting the forest floor, fruit starting to go overripe, and having the animals explore that and find that in a different part of the enclosure is definitely a way of enriching that type of feed that I hadn't thought of before. Obviously, if you're letting the animals hunt, that's going to be a huge enriching experience for them. But if you're getting into the habit of providing the quite often very nutritious foods that the powdered foods offer, it's just you're eliminating that hunting and that activity. So moving it around is a really good idea. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, and even again, like, it's something that you don't think of till you see it. But a lot of these berries get so ripe in these hot, humid conditions that they're almost a mush themselves. So when they fall from the higher levels of the canopy, they sit on this understory and they almost like smear onto leaves and branches. So they've almost done the whole preparation process for what these artificial foods or prepared diets sort of have or simulate. And so the ability to actually sort of, it would be very messy to start smearing, diets all over the enclosure, but definitely using different methods of spreading it around the environment. And obviously you'd need to keep an eye on what your crested gecko is eating. But I think there is this sort of, because they are such wonderful pets and they're really cute and they're really they just fit into that sort of pet sort of position very well, that people are maybe treat them, maybe mollycoddle them a little bit, how they have their cresties favorite food, and have they eaten enough of it, and have they done this? Well, actually maybe spreading it around the environment and maybe trying different flavors and different ways is actually more beneficial and again more enriching for the crested gecko than sort of sticking to your favorite food.
Yeah. And if you have isopods and things in the enclosure, I mean, you smear it on the ground on some leaf litter, the crested gecko might go down and eat that night, but then afterwards the isopods are going to feast on it, and it shouldn't be a problem. So as long as you're not doing a ton of it, I think that's totally fine. Are there any other myths on there that are kind of jumping out at you? And people can go read the article as well to read them all. I think, like we said, we kind of covered a lot of them earlier in the conversation, but if there's any other ones, please go ahead. And if not, we'll chat a little bit more about the Blue River diets as well.
Yeah, no, I think we've actually covered most of them here. So yeah, there's more sort of exploratory sort of text, and obviously all the data and images and stuff in the article in Exotics Keeper magazine. It's already been released, so actually that issue has gone out, but we will maybe we can have a conversation, Dylan, about getting that out to your listeners and finding other ways around it. We're actually exploring a few quite interesting or exciting prospects of getting EK over to the US and Canada hopefully this year. So we'll maybe we'll have a conversation about ways that other people, that the people can read that after it's already been launched, because yeah, EK is there for people to subscribe to. It's free to subscribe for a digital subscription, but we tend to release them month on month to the subs list. So we're now waiting for the next issue, but we'll set up a web page or something so anyone that's listening to this can jump straight in and read that issue.
Okay, that would be awesome. Yeah, I know people would really love to hear it, and I'm sure many people listening are already a subscriber, so either are reading the physical edition if they're in the UK, or potentially, most likely, many of them are already subscribers online. Let's jump into the Blue River Diets. You'd mentioned that they funded the trip, and they're a brand new company, and we're kind of on the topic of diets anyway. So I'm not sure how much you're involved with this company other than, doing some of the research for them, but maybe you can just let us know what they are and what they're up to.
Yeah, so Blue River Diets is a brand of complete Crested Gecko diets. So everything that Crested Gecko needs is in the diet. It's produced with natural ingredients, and the brand was actually established by Peregrine Live Foods, which is also distributes Exotics Keeper magazine. So we have a very close relationship. They're sponsors of the magazine, so yeah, we work very closely with them. And the brand itself is just really exciting. They, as I say, it's in all natural ingredients. It's manufactured in the UK, and there's loads of different sort of extra ingredients that give it like a boost. So one of the most exciting formulas, I guess, for me, or what sort of caught my attention, was the fruit and bug formula. That basically has insect meal in it, so made from black soldier fly larvae, super high in protein, really natural. Black soldier fly larvae is like a really sustainable method of actually adding natural protein to things. So as well as it sort of mirroring natural diets more sort of closely than potentially other formulas, it's also a super sustainable way of increasing that protein intake. And it's also just like there's been a lot of work gone into it to make every sort of flavor really, really fragrant. So it's already getting a really good reception from Crested Gecko keepers. And it's a brand that's willing to actually invest in getting out there and learning more, but also teaching more as well. As I say, like this expedition is not a fully fledged research expedition into Corolophus ciliatus. It's a opportunity to actually show people that wouldn't otherwise get the chance to see New Caledonia exactly how these crested geckos are living. And and I'm glad that they picked EK for the job, because it's something that I'm passionate about. It's something that I do day in, day out. And, it's not necessarily for me to tell my story. It's for me to get interesting stories and tell it to the world. And it's a similar sort of thing with what's happened with this expedition, is to go over there and present, our findings and habitat shots and funky little reels and, interesting sort of myth busting and just that digestible kind of information that doesn't exist for crested geckos, frankly. Yeah. There are some awesome books out there and people have done these expeditions in the past, but in that format, I'm very pleased to be working with Blue River Diets to sort of push that education sort of from the new keeper up and also inspire people that have been keeping and breeding crested geckos for a long time,
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Is there something that the folks over at Blue River that sparked them to create a diet? I mean, we have lots of other similar products on the market. Is there something that they said, well, these products are kind of missing out on, or is it kind of that high fragrance side to more replicate the ripening fruit in the wild, or is there some sort of differentiating thing that they thought, I gotta spearhead something?
Yeah, well, I think it's the fact that it was all natural. Everything is produced from natural ingredients and as organic as possible as well. And also the fact that it's manufactured in the UK, it's got a lot smaller carbon footprint than some of the sort of big, sort of well-established brands. So even across the UK and also into Europe, it's just an interesting brand. And it's even just the branding and stuff like that, and it's something that's accessible to new keepers. It's got all the goodness in there that you can imagine, really. As I say, they're super high in like antioxidants from the honey that goes in there, actual insects in the formula, really easy to sort of mix and give to your crested geckos. And you know that everything is in there, and even the vitamins and minerals that are added are all from natural sources. It's the closest thing to crested gecko's diet that also ticks every single box. So I would not recommend that somebody goes out and only feeds Blue River diets, but the idea is that everything is in there. So when they feed their insects on top of that sort of formula, that's the enrichment side of things, that realistically they can experiment with using black soldier flies or silk moths that fly around, or they can try a different insect, and realistically they know that no matter what, their crested gecko is getting everything that they need. And and I think that is really special, because you think what can then be built on top of that. The crested gecko is getting everything that they need, and the keeper feels confident that they can start exploring new sort of ways of keeping. And we're all here to sort of advance our own keeping, and that's a great sort of place to start.
Yeah, definitely. And is it only available in the UK right now, or is there some available? Is it making its way to North America yet?
So it's only available in the UK now, but potentially, depending on when this goes out, there might be some news about a US launch. I don't think they're being secretive about this, but you might have to cut this. But it should be overseas before the end of the year.
Okay. All right. So people will. So either you'll let me know if we need to remove that part, and if we don't need to remove it, then the people can just stay on touch with their social medias, and I'm sure that there'll be announcements there, or they can follow along at that point. Thomas, this was an amazing conversation. Is there anything that we didn't say today that you wanted to make sure we mentioned about just this entire experience in general before we wrap up?
I think we've covered most aspects of the New Caledonia trip. But obviously there's loads of information, there's data readings, there's photos, there's videos online. But, on the EK, through EK magazine, people can read that article and get a really good sort of sense of what happened on that expedition. But we will also be releasing more sort of videos and photos and stuff through the Blue River social media. So on Instagram, also the website is going to be updated with some more sort of robust care suggestions and things like that based on the wild research. But also, EK magazine is we're working on loads more sort of video content from my wider trip, but also from New Caledonia. There's still more stuff to come. And in fact, there was one thing that we probably haven't mentioned that might be a nice little segue actually into something else. But one thing that I don't think people understand very much within herpetoculture is that crested geckos and gargoyle geckos are not sympatric. They don't live side by side. They don't occupy the same habitat. They don't even occupy the same sort of ecological niche, and yet very often you see almost an exact replica of their captive husbandry. And so I'll be working on some more bits around gargoyle geckos. We didn't manage to find any, so that's why it's not been a top priority. But the habitat is there. Even some of the literature that you can actually find on also points towards some common misconceptions, and the New Caledonia stuff. But we also want to make sure that we are interviewing the right people, speaking to the right people, and just trying to get a proper solid article on gargoyles, on leeches, on Maniera gecko. There's more to come.
Okay, awesome. And as far as the video content, is there a YouTube channel for EK, or is it just going to be on Instagram, on Facebook, and whatnot?
So we do actually have a YouTube channel, but it's not one that we use very often. So actually Instagram. But I also visited Australia this year and got some really cool sort of habitat shots and information on a bunch of different species. Actually, a few pike on key monitors. Recently, I think it's in the same issue as the New Caledonia expedition article. So there's stuff to go there, and perhaps the YouTube stuff will take off, but it's just as and when I find time to put it all together.
Yeah. Okay. So people can kind of keep an eye on Instagram and whatnot to see when things get posted, and either way, they'll see the content that you were able to capture there. So, Thomas, thank you so much for coming on the podcast again and telling us all about your journey. And like we said at the beginning of the show, it's as popular as crested geckos are, it's very odd that we don't have a ton of experience of people going to these places to capture the information. So thank you so much. Can you let everybody know, just to make sure they know where the Instagram page is and the website and everything for both EK and Blue River?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's at Exotics Keeper is Instagram, Exotics Keeper on Facebook, at blue_river_diets on Instagram for Blue River Diets, and Blue River Diets on Facebook. Exoticskeeper.com, blueriverdiets.com, you'll find it there.
Awesome. Well, Thomas, it was a pleasure as always, so thank you very much for being a guest again.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dylan. It's been great catching up again, and hopefully I'll speak to you again soon.
All right, that is the end of the episode. Thank you so much for listening. Thomas, thank you so much for being a guest on the podcast again. Again, as I said at the beginning, you very much have a dream job for many of us who are either listening or myself, talking to you. To be out in the environment and exploring the natural world and being able to write about it is fascinating, and we're so grateful that you're able to do that in New Caledonia and extract some really important information for many of us who keep crested geckos. I can't wait to see how the project evolves and some of the video footage that's going to be coming out in the future. So listeners, if you did enjoy it, make sure you let us know on either YouTube or Spotify. You can leave a comment or just share it on social media. That's a really big way to help the listeners or help the show find new listeners and help the show grow is really important. You can also join us over on Patreon at patreon.com/animalsathome. If you do join us over there, you have early access to episodes and you instantly get access to the Discord server so you can have conversations with like-minded people like yourself. You can check out customreptilehabitats.com, which is an affiliate link in both the show notes and the YouTube description. If you make a purchase, a small commission comes back to me at no extra cost to you. And of course, that helps me support the show. And that is the end of this episode. Again, thank you to Liam Sinclair of Reptiles and Research for editing this episode. And I will catch everybody in the next one.